my name is Juanita. I am the Chief Adjudicator for Panama WUDC 2025. And today we're going to do a motion debrief of the motion for novice semis of Accra Open 2024, which reads as follows. This House prefers a world in which companies that use open source software in the production of new technology cannot file a patent on the resulting product. A couple of observations about this motion. Evidently, this is a motion that is this House prefers a world, which means that the motion is backwards looking, meaning that the team in government is expected to envision a world in which, since the existence of open source softwares, companies would not have been able to file a patent of the resulting products they do or create when using open source softwares. This does not mean that what we're doing is currently prohibiting them from filing a patent. It means that from the get-go, since the existence of open source softwares, any company would have been able to file for those patents. And this is crucial in order for you to understand two things. The first one is you need to outline how this changes the incentives or not of the different actors within the debate. The corporations that create technology products through open source software, the developers or creators of open source softwares, and the consumers of this new technology. Second, it is important for you to acknowledge that your impacts are not only future-looking, but can be about how this would have changed the access or how this could have changed the development of technology in the past and in the present and the future, meaning that you can achieve bigger impacts and explain how the development of the world would have been different. So having that in mind, let's go over the arguments for government and the arguments for up in this motion. Let's start talking about government. The first argument on government is that this is a more fair world, or a world that complies better with the purpose that developers had when creating open source softwares. Why is this the case? Because most of the times when developers create an open source software, their will is for it to be open and to reduce the barriers of access that many of the people have when creating or engaging with software and creating new technology. When corporations and other actors use this open source software to create a product that is therefore patented, it means that the software is not being used for its purpose, which was to create broader access to the system, broader access to technology, and by contrast, creates more barriers of entry to consumers and to other developers in other corporations and businesses, ultimately meaning that a world in which companies cannot file for patents is a world which is more fair and complies better with the purpose of open source. Second argument that can be run by government in this case is the argument about exploitation of the work of others. Open source softwares, most of the times, are not remunerated, which means people are not being paid for the creation of open source softwares. Most of the times, they are created by people who have the will to create these open source softwares, but they are not receiving any utility whatsoever. In scarce cases, corporations do fund the creation of open source softwares, but the thing is, ultimately, in this sort of cases, what you have is someone who created an open source software who's not receiving any kind of remuneration for the existence and the use of that open source software. But that open source software is enabling the creation of a product that is going to create a utility for a third party that is not going to remunerate or to give back to the developer of that open source software, basically creating a system of exploitation in which these open source developers do not get any compensation, but these big corporations that have benefit from the existence of that software are gaining benefits without giving it back to the developers of the open source software. Third argument that government can run is how this could change and create broader access to products and services. And this argument is quite simple. The first line or the first burden of proof that this argument has is why is it that open source softwares would still exist in either side of the house? And this explanation comes from the incentives that different actors have to create open source softwares. Many of the creators of or developers of open source softwares do not do it because they are gaining funding for corporations or because they have capitalistic or commercial benefit from creating the software. They do it because they care about communal access. They do it because they care about reducing the barriers of entry, and they create them by virtue of the fact that they believe in the principles of broader access to most of the community, which means that it is likely that open access softwares would have been created in either side of the house. And therefore, in a world in which those softwares create products that cannot be patented, those products would have been available and cheaper from the get-go to most of the consumers, which means more quality of life for them. Those products and new technology would have been available from the get-go for enterprises and corporations, meaning they could optimize resources, they could do or they could be more productive or less wasteful or overall do their job better and create more productivity, more like a more dynamic economy and a better service for consumers in reality from the get-go, which means all the benefits would have been happening since the creation of open source softwares and would have created those benefits for far more people during a longer period of time, meaning that broader access to products and services would have been better in terms of the development of innovation and would have been available to create the social benefits in reality from the beginning of the open source software and not force consumers to wait for the products to for the patent to expire or for the democratization of these products in the future or for the prices to go down in the future because of the incentives of corporations. Therefore, they would have had access in a better, in a broader sense from the get-go. Fourth argument by government is in terms of competition. Most of the times, the fact that corporations can file for patents of these products means that they do not have incentives to improve these products. They do not have incentives to give better pricing for these products. And they do not have an incentive to better the quality or make improvements to these products, basically because they are the only ones offering them because they have a patent over them. This means that there is lack of innovation. There is lack of competition, which ultimately harms consumers, harms their ability to access better goods and services. But secondly, it creates the ability for corporations to do trolling patenting, which is basically when corporations file for patents just because they are not going to commercialize the product, but they do not want other corporations or enterprises to have access to that improvement, to have access to the enhancement of the open source software, or just because they do not want other corporations to benefit or to exploit that that new technology that they have created, not because they want to commercialize it, ultimately meaning that that trolling patenting ultimately chills innovation and does not let other corporations and smaller enterprises enter the market in order to compete. It creates more ability to monopolize. In a world in which this does not happen, the ability or the possibility of monopolies is far less in reality. Let's go over the arguments for opposition in this motion. Number one, why in a world in which corporations could not file for patents of new technology created by open source, there would be less incentives to develop open source softwares. Even if there are incentives to create an open source software, given what I already outlined that can be argued by government, the problem is those developers do not have enough funding, do not have enough capacity, and they need corporations to do investments in order to develop those open source softwares. But the problem is, at the end of the day, when corporations are not going to get any utility whatsoever from the existence of those open softwares, they are not going to have an incentive to fund them. This means even if those open source softwares would exist in either side of the house, because there would have been incentives for their creation inside government, the amount of open source softwares would have been reduced radically inside government, because there would have been less funding and less availability of resources to create them, ultimately meaning that the benefits of those open source softwares would have been less just by mere fact that the open source software would have been more difficult to create. But secondly, corporations would have an incentive for those softwares to be closed to begin with, because they would not have an incentive to fund an open source software, ultimately meaning that the barriers of entry would have been bigger than the ones that exist currently. And this leads us to the second argument from up, which is, in the comparative, the system is far more balanced. Why? Because the system is hybrid. Corporations have an incentive to fund open source softwares because they know if they create a product through that, they still can file for a patent. So ultimately, they fund the open source software and create products from it and patent those. In reality, if that would not have been the case, the open source software would not exist to begin with, would have been closed, and therefore all the benefits that people could have from using that open source software, even if they cannot access the product that is created, are eliminated from side government. Ultimately meaning that it is far better to have the hybrid model that enables, at least for the open source software to exist, to be funded by corporations instead of being closed to begin with. The hybrid model creates a world in which corporations can find a middle ground between open source and finding utility from new technology being patented. Last argument from up is the idea of the chilling effect of innovation. How does this argument look like? It is likely that corporations are not going to be incentivized to use open source software to create new technology, but they are also not going to be incentivized to create a similar closed software, because they know that nobody would use that closed software that nobody would, that it would not create utility. So at the same time, companies are not going to use the open source software, but are not going to create another one that's similar that they can use, meaning that they are not going to create products through that software, through that system, meaning all the products that could arise from those open source softwares are going to be less. Why is this the case? Because corporations have a bigger incentive and more capacity to create these products. Even if inside government, those products could have been created because of necessity, because of altruism, or because of whatever of the reasons that can be outlined by government, the amount of time, the amount of resources, the amount of dedication and expertise corporations have can be are very difficult to be paralleled by other actors, meaning that the quality of those products is going to be far less inside government. Even if those products are patented inside up, corporations still have an incentive to give broader access or to not have very expensive products. One, because they want to sell them. Two, because governments pressure them to give broader access. Three, because they care about their image. And lastly, worst case scenario, eventually patents expire, ultimately meaning that in the long run, the creation of those products can benefit a lot of people in the future when those patents expire, in comparison to the non-existence of these products. It is preferable to have them exist, even if they are patented, than to have them not exist, because corporations are not incentivized to use these open source softwares, and there are not other actors that can create to this at the same speed, to the same level of expertise than corporations can do, because of the muscle they have in terms of capital and in terms of labor. In reality, those are the main arguments behind this motion. I hope this was enlightening to you, and I hope to see you in Panama really soon.